This seat is not for you." Jordan Carter froze. In his hand was a first-class ticket, clearly marked. Seat 2A. For a moment, the world around him seemed to slow down. The loudspeaker announcing flights, the rattling of suitcase wheels across polished stone floors, all faded into the background, leaving only the cold stare of the man in front of him. Captain Richard Hawthorne, 50, 2 years old, neatly cropped salt, and pepper hair under a cap trimmed with gold, carried the arrogance of someone who believed that power in the skies belonged solely to him. Jordan narrowed his eyes, not out of surprise. He had lived under that gaze all his life, scrutinized, doubted, blocked. But this time, it happened right at the doorway to first class, where he had paid in full, where he had just become the rightful owner. JFK Airport in the morning was chaos, a symphony of motion. Business travelers rushed through emails, families huddled tightly, gripping their children's hands. Weary-eyed tourists shuffled after long flights. In the middle of it all, Jordan stood out, not because of his tall 6'2" frame in a tailored charcoal suit, but because of the steady presence of a man who commanded an empire. At 45, he had built Carter Global from a modest logistics company into a sprawling conglomerate. Today, the acquisition of Atlantic Skies Airways was set to close. In the leather briefcase he carried were the documents that would finalize the transfer of power. And yet, the only obstacle in his way at this moment was the captain of the very airline he was about to own. "Are you sure you're not mistaken?" Jordan held out his ticket, voice calm but edged with steel. Richard Hawthorne glanced at it without truly looking. "There must be an error at the gate. Seat 2A is reserved for VIPs. Someone named Carter. I'm waiting for him." Jordan stared directly at him. "I am Jordan Carter." Those words were not just a statement of fact, but a challenge. For an instant, the cabin seemed to stop breathing. Several white passengers already seated turned their heads in disbelief. A middle-aged woman covered her mouth, whispering to her husband, "Who does he think he is?" Richard smirked, his suspicion curdling into open disdain. "Do you have any proof?" Jordan pulled out his wallet and showed his identification. Richard's hand faltered when he saw the matching name. But then he added, "From Atlanta? The Carter I know lives in New York." "Yes, I was born in Atlanta. I live in New York now." Jordan's voice was low but unyielding, each word sharp as steel striking stone. Still, Richard shook his head. "Perhaps you should return to the gate and verify. People like you don't usually sit here." "People like you." The phrase landed heavy, brutal. Anger surged inside Jordan, but he held it down. 2 decades in business had forged in him an iron composure. He didn't need to shout or prove himself to those who refused to see. His true power was in the documents inside his briefcase, in the decisions that were about to redefine the future of this airline and the career of the man standing in front of him. Passengers murmured. A businessman in a polo shirt stared at the floor, pretending not to hear. A young flight attendant looked torn, wanting to intervene but retreating under the weight of her superior. The cabin air thickened, taut like a string about to snap. Jordan drew a deep breath, his words measured and deliberate. "Captain Hawthorne, my ticket says 2A. My identification confirms who I am. If you continue to block me, you'll have to explain not just to me, but to your airline." Richard hesitated, then quickly regained his authoritative posture. "I am responsible for safety on this flight. That includes verifying passengers." "No," Jordan replied, his voice dropping, sharp as a blade. "What you are doing has nothing to do with safety. This is prejudice, and a prejudice has never helped a plane leave on time." The cabin fell silent. The sound of rolling luggage outside drifted faintly in. An invisible collision of power was unfolding, a captain clinging to the belief of absolute authority in the skies, and a man he dismissed who in truth was the new master of it all. Jordan locked eyes with him. A thought flickered in his mind. If this is how a captain treats me, without knowing who I am, how many passengers before me have endured the same without anyone to defend them? He lowered himself into seat 2A. The movement unhurried yet resolute, a declaration in itself. "I belong here." Richard squinted, his face flushed with indignation at being defied in his own domain. His jaw tightened. "This isn't over." He turned and strode back toward the cockpit. Jordan leaned into the seat, gazing out the window. The morning sun glinted off the silver fuselage. Above his head in the overhead bin, the leather briefcase held a contract worth billions, waiting for his digital signature. In just 12 minutes, ownership would shift. And when it did, Richard Hawthorne's fate would be sealed. Not in the sky he thought he ruled, but on the ground that no longer belonged to him. Jordan closed his eyes briefly. His heart pounded, but his gaze burned steady. The storm had not yet broken, but he was ready. A single first-class ticket, seemingly ordinary, had ignited a battle between prejudice and true power. And the man humiliated before so many was the very one capable of changing the destiny of them all. The morning rush at JFK surged like a river of people. But in Jordan Carter's mind, all the noise faded, replaced by the steady rhythm of memory, the rhythm that had shaped him into the man he was today. Jordan was born in Atlanta, where the southern sun burned through easy dreams. As a teenager, he would stand at the edge of long lines, watching his father, Joseph Carter, drive an old truck day and night to make deliveries. His father would always say, "Son, if you want to move forward, you must make time your friend. Never let it become your enemy." Those words carved themselves into Jordan's soul, and the old watch his father left him now rested on his wrist, a symbol of that promise. At 20, Jordan launched his business from a room no bigger than a dorm, with 3 employees and a handful of leased trucks. He drove routes himself, from the cracked roads of Georgia to the crowded highways of New York. His hands once rough from frozen steering wheels, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. But Jordan wasn't just delivering packages, he was delivering trust. 25 years later, Carter Global had become a vast conglomerate, expanding from logistics into technology, telecommunications, and now aviation. His career was built with sweat, discipline, and the scars of prejudice. And today, every mile driven, every moment of pain, every word his father had left him, had led to this. Seat 2A of a flight that would change everything. Emily Zhao, his sharp and careful assistant just over 30, called in from the Manhattan office. Her voice came through his earpiece. "The shareholders are nervous about the aircraft maintenance reports. They're worried it could hit the stock price." Jordan closed his eyes for a brief moment. Anxiety, an inevitable companion in every major deal. Tell them I've already ordered a full review of the fleet. Results will be released by this afternoon. Carter Global never hides the truth. On the other end, Emily typed rapidly, keys clattering. Yes, sir. I'll inform them immediately. Jordan ended the call and handed his boarding pass to the gate agent. Kimberly's eyes hesitated as she looked from the ticket to his face. That flicker of doubt was something Jordan knew too well, the unmistakable shadow of prejudice. Is there a problem? He asked calmly. Kimberly forced a smile. No, Mr. Carter. Have a good flight. But her voice trembled, betraying her unease. He walked down the jet bridge, his leather shoes striking the floor with measured weight. The heaviness on his shoulders came not from the briefcase he carried, but from the responsibility of 45,000 Carter Global employees, soon to be joined by 8,000 from Atlantic skies. With each step, he remembered the faces of those early employees, drivers who had trusted a young black man with nothing but determination. Now, he was the living embodiment of that trust. The first-class cabin gleamed, leather seats fresh with the scent of polish mingling with coffee. Jordan placed his briefcase in the overhead bin and settled into seat 2A. Outside the window, the morning sun flashed against the silver fuselage. In that rare, quiet moment, he opened his phone and reviewed the contract. With a single electronic signature, Atlantic Skies would officially belong to Carter Global. A deal worth billions, but its true value was in its reach, reshaping an entire industry built on tradition and arrogance. As he sipped his water, he felt eyes on him from nearby passengers. Curiosity, doubt, a touch of disdain. Jordan was used to it. They didn't know, or didn't want to believe, that the man they were staring at was the new owner of the plane they sat in. A surge rose in his chest, equal parts fury and pride. He thought of every time he had been pushed out, told he didn't belong, and every time he had returned, stronger, higher. The cabin door opened. The sound of firm footsteps echoed. A figure approached. Captain Richard Hawthorne, his Navy uniform stretched across a wiry, rigid frame, his green eyes sharp with suspicion. He glanced at Jordan, then at the boarding pass in the attendant's hand. Jordan knew the storm had begun. To the passengers, he was just a black man holding a first-class ticket. But the truth was hidden. He now controlled the fate of the entire airline. And Captain Hawthorne, the man glaring down at him with arrogance, was about to discover a truth that would shatter his career. The sound of leather shoes striking the carpet in first class echoed like war drums. Captain Richard Hawthorne, a veteran pilot with a weathered face shaped by decades of flying across oceans, walked straight toward Jordan Carter. Every step carried the weight of authority, the belief that in the sky, the captain was the only law. Jordan looked up. Their eyes met, one arrogant, the other calm. In that instant, it was no longer about a disputed seat. It was the clash of two worlds, the old one, steeped in prejudice and pride, and the new one, built on willpower and justice. Sir, Richard began, his voice hoarse and cold, this seat is not yours. It is reserved for premium passengers, someone named Carter. Jordan didn't flinch. He pulled the ticket from his suit pocket and placed it firmly on the table between them. The black and white print was clear. Seat 2A, Jordan Carter. "I believe there's been a mistake," Jordan said slowly, his voice steady but resonant across the cabin. "Because I am the Carter you are looking for." The first-class cabin fell silent. A middle-aged couple in seats 1C and 1D turned, their eyes filled with doubt. A young businessman in 3B gave a mocking chuckle behind his financial newspaper. The flight attendant nearby forced a smile, but her fingers gripped the edge of her tray until her knuckles turned white. Richard glanced at the ticket, frowned, then looked back at Jordan with a shake of his head. "You're saying you're Jordan Carter?" "Yes," Jordan replied, his gaze unwavering. Richard waved his hand dismissively. "Impossible. The Carter I know is a New York businessman, someone from a fine background, not like you." The last two words dropped heavy, like a gavel strike. "Like you?" Jordan tightened his grip on the armrest, though his face remained composed. He had heard those words thousands of times in his life. Words that didn't need to be said outright, but everyone understood, pointing to his skin, his roots, his presence in a place where they thought he didn't belong. "Do you have any identification?" Richard pressed, as though proving himself was Jordan's duty. Jordan pulled out his wallet and handed over his ID. Richard held it under the cabin light, his eyes lingering in deliberate suspicion. He sneered. "Atlanta? The Carter I know lives in New York." Jordan exhaled, his voice cutting each word with precision. "I was born in Atlanta. I now live in New York, and I am the CEO of Carter Global." A wave of whispers rippled through the cabin. A passenger in 2C snapped his head up, eyes wide. An elderly woman in the back row shook her head and muttered, "These days, anyone can call themselves a CEO." Richard tossed the ID back with disdain. "I don't care what you call yourself. On this plane, I make the decisions. And I don't want you in this seat until everything is clarified." Jordan tilted his head, eyes sharp as steel. "I've shown my ticket, my valid documents. What more do you want, Captain?" Richard leaned down, close enough for only Jordan to hear, though loud enough that nearby passengers could catch the tone. "Men like you don't belong in first class. Not on my plane." The words fell like an iron hammer, stripping away the veneer of safety protocols to expose the raw prejudice beneath. Fury surged in Jordan's chest, but he kept it chained. His eyes burned, not with the look of a humiliated passenger, but of a king being challenged on his throne. He leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "Captain Hawthorne, Seat 2A is mine. If you want me gone, you will have to explain that not just to me, but to this airline and to its new owner." Richard faltered for a second, then masked it with a smirk. "New owner? Don't tell me you're trying to scare me with rumors about some corporate takeover." Jordan reclined into his seat, gaze locked. His father's words echoed in his mind. True strength isn't in the loudest voice, but in the power to silence an entire room when you speak. Across the aisle, a 60-year-old white businessman pretended to read his paper, but his eyes flicked nervously at the scene. The young flight attendant, Diane, stood frozen, pale, faced, wanting to intervene, but paralyzed by her captain's authority. The cabin became a stage, every glance and every breath a witness. Jordan tapped the armrest lightly, each word deliberate and heavy. "I have the ticket. I have the documents. I have the right. If you want to turn this into a bigger issue, go ahead. But remember this, when the truth comes out, you will be the one explaining yourself. Richard's face flushed crimson, his teeth grinding. He straightened and raised his voice, as though to reassert dominance before the passengers. I demand you vacate this seat immediately. If not, I will call security. Jordan smiled faintly, a smile free of fear, but rich with something Richard couldn't comprehend. The certainty of a man who held the fate of the entire airline in his hands. To the passengers, it looked like a powerless man being humiliated. But behind that grey suit was the true master. And Captain Hawthorne had no idea that every word he spoke was digging the grave of his own career. Richard Hawthorne still stood tall before Seat 2A, his eyes blazing as if he could burn down the man who dared to challenge his authority. Jordan Carter sat still, both hands resting on his knees, back straight as a blade. He did not need to raise his voice to prove himself. He knew that in the greatest battles, it was the calm one who truly held the knife. Diane, the young flight attendant, swallowed hard, her tray trembling in her hands. She felt as though she was standing in the eye of a storm. On one side was the captain, the man who could determine her fate on every flight. On the other was the passenger, a black man radiating a presence that was both calm and commanding. A memory surfaced in Diane's mind. 2 years ago, she had filed a complaint against Richard for the demeaning comments he had made toward a Latino colleague. That complaint had mysteriously disappeared. Like many others, she had learned to stay silent. Now, watching Jordan stand his ground, she felt fear, but also a faint spark of hope. Mr. Carter, Richard spat out the name as though he could bend it. I am responsible for this entire flight. If I say this seat is not yours, then it is not. Do I make myself clear? Jordan tilted his head slightly, his voice low but sharp as steel. Captain Hawthorne, I paid for this seat. I have the documents. I have the legal right. What you're leaning on isn't safety protocol. It's prejudice. Richard froze for half a second. He wasn't used to being confronted, especially by a black passenger. Veins swelled at his temples. He barked loudly, his voice meant for the entire cabin. I order you to leave this aircraft immediately. That is a direct command. The first-class cabin erupted in murmurs. Some passengers discreetly raised their phones to record. They didn't know it yet, but that footage would soon become the center of a media firestorm. Jordan closed his eyes briefly, drawing in a deep breath, holding back the storm pounding inside his chest. In his mind, he saw his father again, the man who had once been denied service at a gas station because of the color of his skin. Jordan had been only 10, clutching his father's hand, unable to understand why those people had said they didn't belong there. Now, 35 years later, the words "men like you don't belong in first class" echoed again. But this time, Jordan was no longer a powerless child. He was a man who could change the game. He opened his eyes, his gaze sharp, his voice carrying like a command. If you want me removed, call security. And be ready to explain yourself to this airline, to the board of directors, and to the new owner of Atlantic Skies. Richard gave a dry laugh, brittle as stone scraping against metal. The new owner. Don't be ridiculous, Carter. I know who's buying this company, and it certainly isn't you. Jordan said nothing. He only smiled, a quiet smile that Richard could not decipher. In that smile was confidence, a secret, something that made the entire cabin uneasy. Across the aisle, a young businessman lowered his head to his laptop, but his ears caught every word. He had attended last week's shareholder meeting, and the name Carter Global had been mentioned. A flicker of suspicion crossed his mind. Could it be true? Diane held her breath. She didn't fully understand, but deep inside, she sensed that this man was not just another passenger. Richard growled. "This is my aircraft. I hold supreme authority here." Jordan leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked on his opponent. "No, Captain. This is the airline's aircraft, and within a few hours this airline will be mine. When that happens, your supreme authority will be over." The cabin froze. Eyes darted between the two men, filled with disbelief and astonishment. Richard took half a step back, then quickly straightened. He could not believe it. He refused to believe it. The loudspeaker crackled. "Main cabin doors closing. Passengers, please take your seats." Jordan leaned back, fingers interlaced, gaze turned toward the window. He had no need to say more, because the truth, sharp and merciless, would reveal itself soon enough. Richard turned away, his face flushed red, shoulders stiff. He felt as though he had just been challenged in his own domain, a domain he thought untouchable. But instead of victory, all he was left with was an uneasy dread. To the passengers, Jordan was still just a black man, sitting in first class. But in the shadows, he was already pulling the strings of power tight. And with a single press of his electronic signature, Richard Hawthorne's entire career would collapse on the very flight he thought he commanded. The cabin door slammed shut. The metallic lock clanked into place like a declaration. This battle would unfold in the sky, with no way out. Richard Hawthorne sat in the cockpit, his hand gripping the control column, his mind spinning with anger. He believed he still held control. But in truth, power was already slipping silently from his grasp. Jordan Carter leaned back in the seat 2A, his fingers tapping a slow rhythm against the armrest. Outside, the morning sunlight spilled across the silver fuselage, reflecting into his eyes with a light that was both cold and proud. He opened his phone, connected to the in-flight Wi-Fi, a simple action, but this time it would decide the fate of thousands. First email. Recipient: Rebecca Lee, Chief Legal Officer, 50 years old, a mind sharp as a blade. Content: Review Richard Hawthorne's personnel file immediately. Send every complaint report from the last 10 years. Prepare disciplinary documents. Await instructions. In less than a minute, Rebecca replied, "Received. I anticipated you would need this. The file is thick and far from clean. Compiling now. Will send securely within 15 minutes." Jordan nodded slightly. He had been right. The man who had just humiliated him in first class was not merely a bigot. He was the embodiment of a rotten system, one that protected its own while burying misconduct. Second email. Recipient: Daniel Brooks, COO, 40-7, the Iron Hand running daily operations. Content: When the Atlantic Skies contract is signed, activate immediate authority. Prepare replacement for Captain Hawthorne. coordinate with HR and PR. Priority, no delays, no leniency. The response came almost instantly. Understood. HR and PR are already on alert. Once you sign, we will act within 30 minutes. Jordan's lips curved into a faint smile. The Carter Global machine ran like clockwork, like the very watch on his wrist, his father's heirloom. With a single tap of the screen, thousands of people would move to his rhythm. His assistant, Emily Zhao, was also in the thread. A message from her appeared. Should I prepare a public statement, in case this escalates into a media storm? Jordan replied, Not yet. Stay silent. When I give the signal, let the world know. He set his phone down and glanced around the first-class cabin. A few passengers were still filming discreetly. They thought they were capturing a petty scene of discrimination. They didn't know that those videos were about to become historic evidence when a CEO exposed his own pilot mid-flight. In the cockpit, Richard struggled to steady himself. He couldn't understand why that passenger had dared to openly defy him. Pilots believed themselves kings of the skies, but never before had one been challenged so brazenly by someone in seat 2A. The more Richard thought, the harder his heart pounded, sweat beading on his temples. In the cabin, Diane cautiously approached Jordan and placed a glass of water on his table. "Sir, is there anything else you need?" Her voice trembled, her eyes lowered, but her hand slid a business card beneath the napkin. On it read, Alicia Watkins, Customer Relations Director. Below, in handwriting, "I'm sorry." Jordan glanced at it, his eyes softening. He gave her a quiet nod of thanks. For a fleeting moment, Diane felt reassured. This man, though cornered, still carried a presence that made her believe the truth would not remain buried forever. Jordan lifted his phone again. A new email from Rebecca had arrived. Hawthorne's file. His eyes scanned the lines swiftly. 7 racial discrimination complaints in 12 years. 3 flight attendants accused him of creating a hostile work environment. 1 first officer requested reassignment to avoid flying with him. All cases dismissed as insufficient evidence or not serious enough, then buried. Jordan inhaled deeply, his eyes flashing. This was the moment. Not just to protect himself, but to end a chain of injustice. He typed a final message to his executive team. Prepare. When Atlantic Skies belongs to Carter Global, I want our first decision carried out immediately, one that will echo far and wide. His phone buzzed. Daniel's reply. We're calling it 12 minutes that changed history. Ready? Jordan smiled. He leaned back, closing his eyes. In the darkness behind his lids, he saw his father's hand holding his own, the gaze of a weary man still filled with resolve. Son, you must master time before it masters you. Now was that moment. While the captain still believed he ruled the cockpit, in seat 2A, an uprising had already begun. With one electronic signature, Jordan Carter would no longer be a humiliated passenger. He would become the owner delivering judgment on an entire system that had long enabled injustice. And the first name on that judgment was Richard Hawthorne. The plane had not yet pushed back from the gate when Richard Hawthorne disappeared into the cockpit. 5 minutes later he returned, but this time he was not alone. Beside him stood a man in an orange safety vest, a name badge pinned to his chest. Thomas Briggs, Ground Operations Supervisor. His eyes betrayed unease, his voice strained as he stepped toward seat 2A. Mr. Carter, it seems there has been a mistake. Captain Hawthorne reports that this seat does not belong to you. We ask that you return to the gate counter for verification." The entire first-class cabin fell silent. Some passengers lifted their heads, waiting for the familiar script. The black man would rise, shuffle down the aisle, humiliated. But Jordan Carter did not move. He turned his wrist slightly, the steel of his father's old watch flashing in the light, then raised his gaze to meet Thomas's. "Supervisor Briggs," Jordan said calmly but firmly, "my ticket says 2A. My documents are valid. The only problem here is that your captain refuses to accept the truth." Richard folded his arms, a smirk tugging at his lips. He believed his power absolute in this cabin. "Passenger safety is the top priority. I cannot allow someone of unclear identity to remain in first class." Jordan leaned forward, his voice dropping, every word striking like a hammer. "My identity is clearer than anyone else's on this plane, and if you want to know, let me make it plain. In 12 minutes, Atlantic skies will officially belong to Carter Global. Which means, Briggs, you are speaking to the new owner of this airline." The cabin erupted with murmurs. A few passengers covered their mouths in shock. Others quickly raised their phones to record every moment. Diane, the young flight attendant, held her breath, her heart pounding. She felt as though she were witnessing a scene from a film, except this was no script. It was reality, unfolding before her eyes. Thomas Briggs' eyes widened, his body jerking back a step. "You're saying you are?" Jordan lifted his phone, turning the screen toward them. The electronic contract glowed, the digital signature line awaiting confirmation. The Carter Global logo sat beside his name. "Yes," Jordan said, his eyes never leaving Richard. "With one tap I sign. And when I do, Captain, every decision you've made today will be recorded in the file, along with its consequences." Richard froze for half a second, then forced out a bitter laugh. "You expect me to believe some performance on a screen? That contract could be fake. I'm the one in charge here, not you." Jordan gave a slight nod, a thin smile touching his lips. "Yes, at this moment you control the cockpit. But real power, Captain, is not about where you sit. It's about who can change the entire system." The first-class cabin held its breath. An older businessman whispered to his wife, "If this is true, everything changes." Thomas Briggs looked from Richard to Jordan, sweat forming on his forehead. He realized that if Jordan was telling the truth, every word he himself had spoken moments earlier had become evidence against him. His eyes wavered as he searched for an escape. "Sir, if that is the case, I was not informed," Jordan replied curtly, his tone icy. "Of course not. Decisions like this are kept confidential. Just remember, once I sign, every action you take today will be included in the internal report, and Carter Global does not tolerate cover-ups." Richard barked, his voice cracking with rage. "You're threatening me?" Jordan remained still. "No, I'm giving you a chance. Return to the cockpit, do your job, and get this plane safely to LaGuardia. After that, we'll have the conversation again. But if you continue to act on prejudice, my very first decision will be to deal with you." The words landed heavy. Richard's lips tightened, his hands trembling slightly with fury. But he said nothing. He spun on his heel and strode back toward the cockpit. The first-class cabin sank into silence after the storm. Passengers still held their phones aloft, recording with trembling hands. Diane bent down, whispering to Jordan, "Mr. Carter, if what you said is true, you may have just changed the entire airline." Jordan turned to her, his gaze softening. "Not me, Diane. The truth. I am only the one refusing to let it be buried any longer." He leaned back, closing his eyes, leaving the cabin awash in stunned whispers. But in his mind, the future was already clear as the sunlight outside the window. In just a few minutes, Richard Hawthorne's mask would fall before the entire world. The captain believed his power was absolute. But right there in first class, he had already confronted the brutal truth. The man he tried to humiliate was the new master of the airline. And the battle was no longer about a seat. It was a warning of an impending overthrow. The engines roared as the aircraft trembled, beginning its slow roll down the runway. Inside the cockpit, Richard Hawthorne clenched his jaw, his eyes fixed on the control panel. In the first-class cabin, Jordan Carter sat still, his eyes half closed as if resting. But beneath that calm exterior, every move was being calculated with precision. His phone buzzed softly. The in-flight Wi-Fi signaled a new email. Jordan opened it. On the screen, the subject line blazed, "Report, Richard Hawthorne, file, strictly confidential." The sender, Rebecca Lee. Jordan scrolled down. The words appeared like a formal indictment. 2012. Complaint from a Filipina flight attendant. Verbal insults about her appearance and accent. Outcome: dismissed, no action. 2014. Latino co-pilot reported Hawthorne for undermining his skills and refusing cooperation in the cockpit. Outcome: filed internally, no action taken. 2017. 2 black passengers reported unfair treatment. Outcome: insufficient evidence. 2019. Black flight attendant reported a hostile work environment. Outcome: file lost. 2021. First Officer Elena Martinez requested reassignment, citing unwillingness to endure Hawthorne's discriminatory behavior. Outcome: request denied. Jordan's eyes raced across each line, his hand tightening into a fist. His chest swelled with a mix of fury and resolve. This was not just one arrogant pilot. This was an entire system complicit in covering up and enabling rot. A new message flashed from Rebecca. "Mr. Carter, this is no longer a personal matter. This is evidence of a complete failure of the old management. If you choose, we have sufficient legal grounds to terminate Richard the moment we land. The decision is yours." Jordan inhaled deeply, his gaze drifting to the window. White clouds drifted lazily against an impossibly blue sky, serene and calm, in sharp contrast to the storm building inside him. He thought of the faces behind those reports, the employees who had dared to speak up only to be silenced. If he stayed silent today, how would he be any different from those who had turned away before? He switched his tablet to notes and typed quickly. "Upon landing, activate ownership rights. Announce the termination of Richard Hawthorne for systemic discriminatory behavior. Replace captain with Elena Martinez for the next flight. Hold press conference immediately at the arrival gate." Launch Ethics First Framework, a program ensuring full transparency of all complaints. His finger hovered for a moment. This would define a new era for Atlantic skies. But he also knew there would be backlash, resistance from unions, from conservatives, from the very system that had thrived on protecting its own. Jordan allowed a faint smile. To create change, you had to embrace the storm. Diane returned with a cup of coffee. Her hand trembled slightly as she set it down in front of him. "Mr. Carter, I just want to say, I've seen the way he treated people. I'm sorry I never had the courage to speak up." Jordan's smile softened. "It wasn't your fault. This system was designed to silence the good. But starting today, that changes." Diane froze for a moment, stunned. In Jordan's eyes, she saw not just the calm of a passenger, but the authority of a leader, a fire strong enough to illuminate the heaviness of the cabin. In the cockpit, Richard remained oblivious. He believed things would blow over, that the man in 2A was just another difficult passenger, and like all the other times, it would fade once the flight was over. He had no idea that every word he spoke, every gesture he made, was being recorded, and that outside, a machine of power was already shifting. Jordan leaned back, lifting the cup of coffee, his eyes fixed on the endless blue sky beyond the window. He whispered softly, only for himself, "This will be your last flight, Hawthorne." The record of his misconduct was laid bare. The voices buried year after year had become daggers turned against him. Jordan Carter now held everything: evidence, authority, and determination. All that remained was for the plane to touch down, when justice would no longer be confined to falls, but spoken aloud before the world. A small chime rang through the first-class cabin, the signal that the Wi-Fi connection was stable. Jordan Carter set his coffee cup down and opened his tablet. The screen lit up, reflecting off his composed face. An urgent video call connected to Carter Global Headquarters in Manhattan. Within seconds, familiar faces appeared. Rebecca Lee, Chief Legal Officer, her eyes sharp as blades. Daniel Brooks, COO, Square, jawed, his voice always carrying authority. Emily Zhao, his assistant, her eyes fixed on her tablet as her fingers flew across the keyboard. And Tanya Williams, head of communications, short hair framing the calm but steely presence of someone who had weathered hundreds of media storms. Jordan gave a slight nod. "Is everything ready?" Rebecca spoke first, her voice clear and precise. "The report is verified. 7 complaints of racial discrimination in 12 years, 3 directly tied to flight safety. No disciplinary action taken. We have full legal grounds for immediate termination." Daniel cut in. "Operations and HR are prepared. The moment you sign the acquisition, control of Atlantic skies transfers to Carter Global. I can have Hawthorne replaced within the hour." Emily looked up, her voice soft but steady. "Social media is heating up. Some passengers have already uploaded video of your confrontation with Hawthorne. It's spreading fast." Tanya nodded. "We have a small window. If we move now, we control the narrative. If we wait, the media will twist it their way. I recommend a press conference right at the arrival gate." Jordan stayed silent for a few seconds. The steady drone of the engines outside sounded like a drumbeat urging him forward. He lifted his head, his eyes burning with clarity. "We don't wait. I'll sign now. Prepare for the fallout, good and bad. This isn't personal revenge. This is a declaration. Carter Global does not tolerate injustice. His finger slid across the screen. A ping echoed. The electronic signature appeared with the words, "Transaction complete. Carter Global owns Atlantic Skies." In that moment, power shifted. The man who had been mocked only minutes ago was now officially the owner of the entire airline. On the screen, Daniel exhaled, a rare smile crossing his lips. "Congratulations, Mr. Carter. The controls are yours." Rebecca gave a firm nod. "I'll send the termination order. With your confirmation, it will take effect the moment the plane lands." Tanya interjected quickly. "Remember, this will be a global media storm. A black CEO being discriminated against on the airline he owns. If you go public immediately, the message will echo worldwide." Jordan closed his eyes, drawing in a long breath. In his mind, he saw the faces of employees who had been abandoned, flight attendants who had filed reports only to see them disappear into the black hole of management. He opened his eyes, his voice steady and hard. "We go public, at LaGuardia, and Richard Hawthorne will never set foot in a cockpit again." Emily allowed herself the faintest smile. She knew this moment would be written into history, not just as a business deal, but as a cultural reckoning. Jordan concluded firmly. "Daniel, line up his replacement. Rebecca, finalize the paperwork. Tanya, draft the press release, but leave part of the story for me to tell. It has to be my voice, not just a peace statement." They all nodded. The call ended. The screen went dark, leaving only Jordan's reflection in the glass. The first-class cabin was still hushed. Some passengers had set their phones down, now staring at him with puzzled expressions. A man both calm and radiant, as if carrying a secret no one could touch. Diane stepped closer, her voice low. "Mr. Carter," I overheard. "Are you really?" Jordan turned toward her, his eyes gentle but firm. "Yes, and I promise you from today forward, no employee will ever be forced into silence again." And tears shimmered faintly in Diane's eyes. She nodded and stepped away. Her heart lightened as if shedding a burden she had carried for years. In the cockpit, Richard slumped into his seat, his mind restless. Something about that passenger unsettled him. The man didn't flinch, didn't back down like all the others before. Richard remembered Jordan's eyes, not the eyes of a victim, but the eyes of someone holding the blade. He gripped the controls tighter. "We'll see how long you last, Carter," he muttered. But deep within, an unfamiliar fear had begun to creep in. At 30,000 feet, a single meeting had changed destiny. Jordan Carter was no longer a humiliated passenger, but the rightful CEO of Atlantic Skies. He had made his decision to fire Richard Hawthorne and to turn this flight into a declaration of a new era. And when the wheels touched the ground, the entire world would witness it. The familiar chime echoed through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, prepare for landing." The plane shuddered gently as it descended. Through the window, Manhattan came into view in the distance, glass towers gleaming under the morning sun. Jordan Carter tightened his seatbelt, his eyes narrowing. He knew that in just a few minutes, the wheels would touch the ground, and when they did, the truth would be revealed. But he was not willing to wait. He wanted the verdict delivered here, in the sky, before everyone present. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. The sound of the seat snapping upright drew heads around the cabin. Diane rushed forward in alarm. "Mr. Carter, please sit down. The sign is still on." "This is a critical moment." Jordan raised his hand, his voice calm but commanding. "I need to see the captain now. This is no longer just about one passenger. This is about the entire airline." The words rang out, setting the first-class cabin abuzz. Phones were lifted again. No one could believe a passenger would demand to see the captain during descent. The cockpit door swung open. Richard Hawthorne emerged, his face flushed red, his voice a growl. "Carter, have you lost your mind? Sit down immediately, or I will have you restrained for obstructing flight safety." Jordan turned, his voice resonating like a judge's ruling. "Captain Hawthorne, I officially inform you, as of 15 minutes ago, Carter Global has completed its acquisition of Atlantic Skies, and as CEO, I declare that you are terminated, effective immediately." The cabin erupted. Gasps filled the air. A few passengers exclaimed out loud, "Oh my God!" Phones rose higher, capturing every second. Richard froze, his face stiffening. Then he gave a hollow laugh, his voice cracking. "Terminate me. On this plane, I am the only authority. You cannot strip that from me." Jordan slipped a document from his vest pocket, a printed copy of the signed transfer and personnel order. He held it up to Richard, his voice sharp as steel. "This is the official order. 7 racial discrimination complaints in your file. 3 incidents tied directly to flight safety, all covered up. But today the truth surfaces, and your career ends here." Richard's hands trembled, the paper rustling loudly. His eyes flared with a mixture of rage and desperation. You'll regret this. The union won't let it stand. I'll sue you for..." A voice rose from behind him. "No, Captain." Elena Martinez, the first officer, stood in the cockpit doorway. Her voice was calm, but resolute. "I have worked with you directly for the past 2 years. I have witnessed it all, and I am ready to confirm everything Mr. Carter has said. You have crossed the line too many times." Richard spun around, his face stricken. "You too, Elena." Elena lifted her chin. "It's not me turning against you. You turned against yourself long ago." Jordan stepped forward, his voice steady and booming in the silence of the cabin. "Captain Hawthorne, you have 2 choices. 1. Step down, hand control to First Officer Martinez, and let her land this plane safely. 2. Security will be waiting on the tarmac to escort you away in disgrace. Choose." Richard gripped the edge of the seat, veins bulging on his forehead. For a moment it seemed he might lash out, but dozens of eyes were fixed on him, phones recording every flicker of his rage, and Jordan's commanding voice weighed down on him. His shoulders sagged. He dropped the papers, stumbling back. His voice came hoarse and broken. You land it." Elena stepped fully into the cockpit, her hands steady as they wrapped around the controls. The door closed behind her. Jordan returned to his seat and fastened his belt. The first-class cabin was silent as stone. In that silence, everyone knew they had just witnessed the unthinkable. A captain stripped of command midair. The wheels hit the runway with a screech. The fuselage rattled, then slowed. A perfect landing. Elena Martinez, once the co-pilot, was now the one in charge. When the plane rolled to a full stop, it marked the end of an era. Richard Hawthorne had lost everything, not to storms or accidents, but to his own arrogance and prejudice. And Jordan Carter, once humiliated as a passenger, had risen to deliver the verdict, transforming an ordinary flight into a historic moment. The cabin door swung open, and a flood of bright light poured in. A line of airport security stood waiting, their faces stern. Richard Hawthorne stepped out first, his shoulders slumped, his uniform still neat, but his eyes stripped of all authority. 2 guards closed in tightly on either side. In front of passengers still recording, he was nothing more than a faded shadow, hollow and disgraced. Behind him, Jordan Carter rose to his feet. He straightened his tie, lifted his leather briefcase, and walked with steady, deliberate steps out of the cabin. Every eye followed him. There was astonishment, admiration, even skepticism. But all could feel it. This man had just done something no one thought possible. The moment Jordan entered the terminal, flashbulbs exploded. Dozens of reporters pressed forward, microphones raised, voices overlapping in a chaotic blur. "Carter, is it true you just fired the captain mid-flight? Do you believe your actions were an abuse of power? Is this a publicity stunt tied to the Atlantic Skies acquisition?" Jordan raised his hand. The noise settled, leaving behind a taut silence. He stepped up to a makeshift podium, hastily set with the Carter Global logo alongside Atlantic Skies. Beside him stood Tanya Williams, communications director, her sharp eyes scanning the crowd. Jordan set down his briefcase and swept his gaze over the room. His voice rang out, every word cutting clear. "This morning, I boarded an Atlantic Skies flight as a passenger. I was blocked, insulted, and told by Captain Richard Hawthorne that someone like me does not belong in first class. Even though I presented a valid ticket and identification, he chose to deny the truth. What he did not know was that only minutes later, I signed the agreement that made Carter Global the official owner of Atlantic Skies." Cameras clicked rapidly. A few reporters audibly gasped. Jordan pressed on, his voice low but resolute. "Hawthorne is not an isolated case. His record contains 7 racial discrimination complaints over 12 years, all ignored. Complaints from flight attendants, from first officers, from passengers, all disappeared. This is not just one man's failure. It is the failure of a system that protected injustice." He paused, his eyes flashing. "Today, we say enough. I declare that Richard Hawthorne has been terminated, effective immediately. And this is only the beginning. Carter Global will implement the Ethics First framework, a transparent system that ensures every complaint is investigated, where nothing can be buried. No more silence, no more cover-ups, no more careers shielded by prejudice." The terminal fell silent. A CNN reporter broke the stillness. "Mr. Carter, many will argue this was personal revenge. What do you say to that?" Jordan looked directly into the camera. "If this were revenge, I would have stayed silent and let him be handled quietly like all the times before. But I did not stay silent. I chose to make it public, Because change does not come from decisions whispered behind closed doors. It comes when the whole world is allowed to see the truth. A sudden burst of applause came from passengers who had disembarked with him. They were witnesses. They had heard. They had seen. And now they confirmed it. The sound spread, and emotion rippled through the crowd. Jordan nodded in thanks, then ended with a voice calm but resounding. I did not do this for myself. I did it for every passenger ever denied, for every employee forced into silence. From today forward, Atlantic skies will change, and our message is clear. Everyone deserves respect, no matter what seat they occupy, what color their skin is, or where they come from. He stepped down from the podium. Flashbulbs still lit the air, but now the eyes fixed on him no longer held just curiosity. They carried recognition. Elena Martinez appeared from the side, her uniform immaculate, her face still tense, but her eyes shining. Jordan shook her hand in full view of the press. "First Officer Martinez," Jordan said, loud enough for the microphones to capture. "From today, you will become captain. That is a reward worthy of your skill and your courage." Elena froze for a moment, then nodded. Her eyes burned bright as dozens of cameras captured the historic moment. At LaGuardia's arrivals hall, Jordan Carter had not only announced the firing of a captain, he had announced a new era. Atlantic Skies would no longer be an airline of prejudice, but one of fairness. From a single denied first-class seat, Jordan had turned it into a platform of declaration for thousands of employees, millions of passengers, and an entire industry. In the world of business, people often say that power is measured by the numbers in a contract or the value of a stock on the market. But the story of Jordan Carter proved something else. True power is measured by how we use it to protect human dignity. A first-class seat that seemed insignificant became the battlefield where prejudice collided with fairness. And Jordan, through his decisive choice, turned a private moment into a shockwave that changed an entire system. This was not just the firing of a captain. It was a reminder that when outdated processes remain silent in the face of injustice, true leadership must be the voice that rises and the hand that acts. If you believe that respect must be the foundation of every flight, every company, and every relationship, press like to spread this message. Do not forget to subscribe to continue with us on the next stories of justice and transformation. And I want to hear from you directly. Leave a comment with just the word fairness to affirm that prejudice cannot take flight and respect will always have its rightful seat